The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse whoever curses you. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." That's Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And I would tell you that these three verses help you and I make sense of everything that is in the book of Genesis. When I was a little kid, I had this toy. It was a little balance toy, and you would set it at the edge of a desk or a table, and it was a bird, and it had this little hooked beak, and you'd put it at the edge of the table, and it would hang there perfectly balanced all the way as long as you would let it sit there. Of course, I didn't let it sit there very long because for me, the game was to see how hard I could hit it without knocking it off. So it never stayed there very long. But theoretically, it'd sit there perfectly balanced forever. And the whole thing sat on this tiny little point of this bird's beak right on the edge. And as a kid, it was fascinating because, of course, it was hanging, wings suspended out over the side, and it looked like it should fall, but yet it was perfectly balanced. And Genesis is much the same way, I think. On the one hand, Genesis looks and feels like this huge, very intense, very long, and very complicated book. It's 50 chapters long. It's got dozens and dozens of stories, short stories, many of which are in wildly different contexts and cultures, and some of which make no sense to most of us. But I would tell you that you can understand the entire book of Genesis through these three verses. Now, we're going to talk about this in much greater detail later, but the promise here has three basic components. Number one is multiplication, right? I'll make you into a great nation. He talks to a guy who's got no kids, and he says he's going to turn him into a great nation. The next one is blessing or favor. He'll bless Israel. Not only he'll bless Abraham and his family, but the blessing here is two pieces. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And then the third one is impact. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So multiplication, blessing, and impact. And although it's not immediately clear to many people that those three pieces are the defining themes of Genesis, and this one promise, these three verses explain everything in Genesis. You see, Genesis itself, the whole 50 chapters, breaks down into three sort of basic sections. There's Genesis 1 through 11, which scholars will call the primordial or the primeval history. But the idea of Genesis 1 through 11 is that there is this relentless and unstoppable cycle that goes from creation to chaos. God creates a beautiful world, and that world quickly descends into chaos. And so Genesis 1 is this perfect, beautiful creation. Sin enters the picture. Everything falls apart. And by Genesis 6, God has to send a flood, and that flood judges the world for the sin. But also that flood cleanses the world to start over. The problem is the minute Noah's family walks out, but the ground essentially is so muddy around their feet, the same habits and patterns and issues that plagued the world before the flood automatically begin to erupt in that family. And so there's a whole second cycle. And that cycle ends with the Tower of Babel, which is a variation on the flood in Genesis. The whole world in Genesis 11 bands together and builds a tower to ascend into heaven, basically to make war upon God. Genesis 1 begins with this perfect, ordered creation. And by Genesis 11, all humanity has banded together in a relentless rebellion against this creation. And the idea that this cycle happens not once, but twice is really important because it basically conveys the idea that the world is locked in this cycle. And so Genesis 12 comes immediately after the Tower of Babel, and it's God stepping into the narrative to say, no more, not again, not on my watch. It's God intervening into this relentless cycle to start something new. So there's a new cycle that begins in Genesis 12 with the verses that we just read. Now, the second section, Genesis 12 through Genesis 36, has a very different feel because there's a very different thing going on. Because now the promise has been given. Right? Genesis 1 through 11 tells us why the promise is important. In Genesis 12, the promise is given. And Genesis 12 through 36 asks a different question. The question of Genesis 12 through 36 is, will God actually fulfill the promise? Because he doesn't fulfill it immediately. In fact, the vast majority of the story of Abraham takes place in between the promise of God and the fulfillment of God. And the tension of Abraham's story is, will God actually ever give him a son? Now, eventually he does. And that's filled with its own difficulties. And when Abram dies, his son takes over, and that's Isaac. And Isaac is, put it bluntly, kind of a fool. His story doesn't last very long. Mostly he's there to give the promise to his son. The problem is that he tries to give it to the wrong son. And so Jacob, who is the third patriarch, steals it and steals his older brother's place. And then the story moves on to him. But the whole throughout here, right, that he goes from no sons to one son. And by the end of Joseph's real narrative in Genesis 36, he's got 12 sons. So the question that dominates the narrative, will God ever keep his promise? By the end of Genesis 36, God does begin to keep his promise because 12 sons is a lot more strong than one son. But the entire middle section of Genesis here gives us the idea that the promise of God is tenuous. That one wrong move or one wrong issue or one wrong situation could cut the promise of God off completely. But then in Genesis 37, now that question begins to get answered, the narrative moves on to something different. The question of Genesis 37 through 50, the story of Joseph, is how durable is this promise? If it exists now, there are 12 sons of the promise. Okay, that part has begun to be fulfilled. But how durable is it, right? The idea here of Genesis 37 through 50 is that Joseph, who's the youngest son, has this dream that he's going to have all of his brothers bow down to him, and his brothers don't like him because Jacob is, put it bluntly, a bad dad. And so Jacob shows favoritism. The brothers sell Joseph off into slavery, and now Joseph is essentially dead. He's cut off. He's cut off from his family, from his people, from his land, from the promise, or so it seems. And so the question of Genesis 37 to 50 is, well, how durable is this promise really? Because Joseph is cut off from everything. He goes to Potiphar's house, which is a wealthy official in the government of Egypt. He's a slave, but the house of Potiphar is blessed because of Joseph's work. And so everything begins to go well, but then he's thrown into jail for some reasons that we're not going to talk about here, because I don't want this video to be struck down. And then he goes to jail. And in jail, the jail is blessed. But he has to toil for a long time in jail. But at the end of Joseph's story, Pharaoh begins to have bad dreams. And eventually Joseph is called to Pharaoh, and he is given charge over the land of Egypt, something that paradoxically he's been training for all along, and now he's actually able to fulfill it. And the question here is, how durable is God's promise? Because the promise isn't just about the number of kids, right? I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Here's the irony of the situation. Joseph is cursed by his family. His brothers sell him into slavery. Egypt gets Joseph, and Egypt is blessed because a famine comes and they have everything they need during the famine. Meanwhile, back home with Joseph's brothers, it's not so good. There's this weird story that we'll talk about later where Judah has not one but two of his sons killed by God for disobedience. And then the famine hits, but the people of the famine, the people of the promise, Joseph's brothers aren't forewarned. Why? Because they've cursed their brother. And Egypt has been forewarned because they have blessed this child of the promise. And so the Joseph brothers have to go and get food from Egypt. And then the brothers are reunited and the promise that started Joseph's story is fulfilled. And this is why I love Genesis so much, because after 50 chapters, and specifically after the end of Joseph's chapter, his dad dies and his brothers start to freak out because they think, well, now that dad's dead, he's not going to protect us from our brother, and our brother is super powerful, so we're goners. Joseph goes to his brothers, and Genesis chapter 50, verse 19 says, but Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done to save many lives. So then don't be afraid. What is fascinating about this, what I love about this, is that this response to Joseph caps off his story with his brothers. Don't worry, guys. You intended to destroy me because you hated me. But this whole thing, my whole long and circuitous journey, was to help. Be with God's will all along. But these words for Joseph actually sort of cap the entire book of Genesis. You see, the whole book of Genesis is about humanity's rebellion against God, against every good thing that God wants to give the world. But it's also about God's unwillingness to let the rebellion of humanity find its completion, because God is forever, constantly stopping it, holding it back. When the world intends to destroy itself through its rebellion and its rejection of sin, God uses that against it. That the world cannot subvert God's ultimate promises, because he created this world and he created this people and he created us for a purpose, and nothing and no one can subvert that purpose. And so by the end of Genesis, we now understand why God established a people. But we also now understand that God's promises are not tenuous. They are extraordinarily durable, and he always keeps them. Sometimes the keeping takes a while, but it always is kept. And that's the beautiful thing about Genesis. That's why Genesis is so important, because we live in a world where we bear and hold the promises of God, but many of those promises have not been fulfilled. We hold promises of healing and of health and of salvation and of answered prayer, but many of those promises have not been fulfilled. And we struggle in the great in-between, which is the defining characteristic of the whole book of Genesis. The between, the creation into chaos, the between promise and fulfillment, the between Canaan and Egypt, right? This long journey between promise and destination is the thing that defines the book of Genesis. And what Genesis tells us in no uncertain terms is that it is going to be okay. That nothing and no one can subvert God's promise. And Genesis is amazing because it builds our faith and it introduces every significant theme in the Bible. And I would argue, and I'll tell you this as we go through this together, that Genesis gives us the entire gospel before we even get to the Gospels. And next week, we actually begin Genesis in earnest. We're going to look at the first two verses in Genesis, Genesis 1:1 and verse 2, because I think Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 might be the most overlooked verse in the entire Bible. Because the story of Scripture does not begin with a bang. It begins with a whisper. It begins with darkness. And if we miss that, we miss almost everything that God is setting out to do. So next week, when we look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we're going to see something pretty dramatic. I'll see you then.